Anne Applebaum's The Iron Curtain, The Crushing of Eastern Europe, 1944 to 1956, is a deeply researched and powerfully narrated account of how the Soviet Union imposed communist regimes on Eastern European countries after World War II. Through detailed case studies, particularly in East Germany, Hungary, and Poland, Applebaum dissects the mechanisms of Sovietization, revealing how the iron grip of Stalinism reshaped these societies, suppressing civil society, eradicating opposition, and enforcing ideological conformity. The book is not just a political history, it is also a cultural and psychological exploration of how totalitarian regimes crush the human spirit and engineer consent, or at least submission, historical background, and the Soviet takeover. Applebaum begins with the power vacuum left by Nazi Germany's defeat in 1945. While Western Europe moved toward reconstruction, democracy, and integration, Eastern Europe fell under the Soviet sphere of influence, as agreed in broad strokes at the Yalta and Potsdam conferences. However, the USSR's promises to support free elections in Eastern Europe were soon broken. Instead, Joseph Stalin ensured that the Red Army's military presence was used to establish puppet regimes loyal to Moscow. Applebaum shows that this process was not inevitable. Many Eastern Europeans hoped for a different post-war future. There were vibrant political parties, strong Catholic institutions, especially in Poland, and a rich intellectual culture that did not naturally gravitate toward Marxism-Leninism. The Soviet takeover required deliberate and often brutal effort. It was not a natural communist revolution from below, but a violent imposition from above. Mechanisms of control. Applebaum's narrative focuses on how the Soviets built totalitarian systems. The book is organized thematically, exploring institutions that were pivotal in reshaping societies. 1. Secret police, the creation of local versions of the Soviet NKVD, such as the Stasi in East Germany, the IVH in Hungary, and the UB in Poland, was central. These agencies arrested former resistance fighters, purged non-communists from public life, and created a pervasive atmosphere of fear. Mass surveillance and arbitrary arrests were routine. 2. Propaganda and censorship. Control of the media played a vital role. Soviet-installed regimes took over newspapers, radio, publishing, and eventually television. History was rewritten to fit Marxist narratives. Applebaum describes how censorship ensured ideological conformity, and how propaganda was used not just to glorify the party, but to sow confusion and suppress alternative worldviews. 3. Youth and education. A major focus of Sovietization was on shaping the next generation. Youth organizations, modeled after the Soviet Komsomol, aimed to indoctrinate children and teenagers with communist ideals. Schools were purged of bourgeois teachers, and new curricula emphasized Marxism-Leninism. 4. Mass organizations. Soviet regimes sought to eliminate all independent civic organizations. Trade unions, women's groups, religious organizations, and sporting clubs were co-opted or disbanded. Only state-sanctioned mass organizations were allowed. Applebaum stresses that civil society, independent spaces between the individual and the state, was systematically crushed. 5. Economy and nationalization. Land collectivization and the nationalization of industry were also crucial tools. In countries like Poland, where there was strong resistance to collectivization, the process was slower, but eventually pursued with violence and coercion. The goal was to eliminate private property and bring all economic activity under state control. Case studies: East Germany, Hungary, and Poland. Applebaum focuses much of her analysis on 3 countries that, while all under Soviet domination, exhibited different levels of resistance and submission. East Germany, GDR. The Soviet zone of occupation became the German Democratic Republic in 1949. Applebaum highlights the deep unpopularity of communism in a society with strong industrial traditions and a non-communist political culture. The Stasi's repressive machinery became infamous, and the state's attempt to build socialism included mass arrests and suppression of dissent. Hungary. Hungary saw rapid Sovietization under Mátyás Rákosi, known as Stalin's best pupil. The AVH secret police terrorized the population, and collectivization was carried out ruthlessly. Yet, Hungary also became one of the first to rebel. The 1956 Hungarian uprising, brutally crushed by Soviet tanks, exposed the fragility of imposed communism. Poland. Poland posed a particular challenge to Sovietization due to its strong Catholic identity and resilient civil society. While the communists eventually took control, they had to tolerate certain concessions to the church and faced long-term resistance from Polish intellectuals and workers. Applebaum explores how Polish communism retained a softer edge, but was still authoritarian at its core. The role of fear and conformity. A central theme of the Iron Curtain is the role of fear in maintaining these regimes. Applebaum provides personal stories of ordinary citizens who were denounced, imprisoned, tortured, or executed. The randomness of state terror created a culture where people self-censored, distrusted their neighbors, and withdrew from public life. However, she also explores how some people became collaborators, not always out of fear, but sometimes out of ambition or belief. This complicates the narrative. Not all citizens were victims. Some willingly served the regime, believing they were building a better future or simply hoping to advance their own careers. Cultural destruction and re-engineering society. Applebaum is especially sensitive to the cultural damage inflicted by Stalinism. Writers, artists, musicians, and philosophers were either co-opted, exiled, or silenced. Socialist realism became the only accepted art form. Independent thought was dangerous, and intellectuals were forced to conform or face persecution. The result was a cultural wasteland, uniform, hollow, and deadening. She recounts how people adapted, many simply disengaged. Others found ways to create parallel societies in private spaces. But the regime's demand for ideological purity meant that even private behavior could be interpreted politically. A joke, a friendship, or a book could ruin a life. Resistance and cracks in the system. Despite the terror, Applebaum emphasizes that the system was never completely stable. Resistance simmered under the surface. The most dramatic examples were the workers' uprising in East Berlin in 1953, the Poznan protests in Poland in 1956, and the Hungarian Revolution later that same year. Each of these uprisings revealed both the anger of the populations and the determination of the Soviets to maintain control at any cost. While the West did little more than offer rhetorical support, these events shook the foundations of the Eastern Bloc and showed that consent had never truly been won. The legacy of the Iron Curtain. Applebaum concludes by reflecting on how deeply Stalinism altered the trajectory of Eastern Europe. The imposed regimes destroyed institutions, demoralized societies, and left psychological scars that endured long after communism fell. The legacy of totalitarianism was not just political, it was spiritual and moral. She also warns against historical amnesia. The tendency to see the Cold War as a stable balance between East and West overlooks the human cost of Soviet domination. The Iron Curtain is a corrective to this complacency. It reminds us that totalitarianism is not just about ideology, it is about the systematic destruction of freedom, truth, and dignity. Critical reception and significance. Anne Applebaum, a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, combines journalistic clarity with scholarly rigor. Her access to newly opened archives and interviews with survivors gives the book a powerful authenticity. Critics have praised The Iron Curtain for its moral clarity, narrative power, and historical depth. The book is not only a historical record, but also a warning. In an age when authoritarianism is resurging in many parts of the world, Applebaum's work is a reminder of how fragile freedom is and how quickly it can be lost.